Is it happening? Am I live? I'm never going to feel 100%. Okay, it's working. I can see it now. I've caught up to the future. What's up, everybody? Happy Friday. I'm really excited to be with you. Full disclosure, some of you guys may know, some of the geekier among you, or those of you rather who've been hanging out with me for a while here on the channel, maybe some of my Colorist Career Accelerator alums. Any Colorist Career Accelerator alums in the house today? Give a shout in the chat. Let me know. Some of you guys may know, especially people from those latter categories, that I am a fine calibrator of my caffeine levels. I'm a big believer in a half calf ratio when I grind my beans, really more like a 55-45. I might have gone full calf this morning, so I'm feeling really excited right now. So maybe I'll talk really fast. Maybe who knows what it's going to be. It's going to be a wild grade school session because I got loose this morning and went with full calf. So we'll see how that goes. Hope you guys are doing great. It's going to be a good session. Who's in here? Okay, Bruno, CCA. Oh, yeah. Troy's in the house. Ian's in the house. Amazing. Awesome. I'm super excited you guys are here. My buddy Rafa's here with me. What's going on, Rafa?
Hello, everyone. I've been playing a lot with matrices as well as the last week, and I'm considering to change my linear gain for a linear 3x3 matrix, and also a gamut mapping before right after that in my usual workflow. So that's the last thing I have learned this week.
So balancing with a linear 3x3 matrix instead of with RGB gains?
Yeah, exactly. And also applying a gamut mapping right after that, because as you probably know, like
to keep things from getting thrown out of the space.
But yeah, those negative values are no bueno.
Yeah, no bueno indeed. Okay, cool. Rafa's flexing on us with some color science. I don't think I've done anything that cool this week. That sounds awesome, man. Cool. Well, what are we talking about today? We're talking about saturation today. I think the title of grade school today is Mastering Saturation. That's not something that I feel like I've gotten to yet at all, but we talked about it this week in this week's video. I hope you guys found that video interesting. Some of y'all may have found it familiar because it's concepts we've actually talked about here in grade school before. But that's what we're going to be focusing on today: is saturation, strategies for saturation, and ways we can think about and understand saturation in a bit more nuance in order to get better results when we are color grading. So let's dive in. Do we have questions yet, Rafa?
Yeah, we were talking about color science, and we have a question about color science. Would you mind sharing what method of saturation your SatShaper DCTL uses for the spherical and the subtracting settings?
Sure, yeah. So, the SatShaper tool, I feel like that's going to be an answer with limited usefulness, because that's a tool that currently is only available to past participants in the Colorist Career Accelerator or participants in the upcoming Colorist Career Accelerator. Quick tangent, quick detour while we are on the subject. The next round of the Colorist Career Accelerator, the fall round of the Colorist Career Accelerator, is coming up in October. I can't believe we're already in September, guys. I can't believe we're already basically in the fourth quarter of this year. Time is real weird. But anyway, the Colorist Career Accelerator is coming up. I'm really excited about it. For those who don't know what in the world that is, it's a 4-day intensive workshop that is aimed at taking you to your next level as a professional colorist, whether you've never graded a job professionally or whether you've been at it for some time and you really want to level up. That's what the Colorist Career Accelerator is all about. It's 4 days, 4 hours a day. I'm there, Rafa's there, my buddy Gadali is there, and we're going through in a focused and systemized way and working through everything that I believe you need to have in order to have a really effective, a really robust color grading practice and color grading business. So we're going to talk about gear, we're going to talk about grading. We're also going to talk about all the nitty-gritty of running a business: estimating, invoicing, templates, negotiation, all these things that come along with being a professional colorist that if you don't know how to do and you don't know how to do them well, you're going to end up losing jobs or getting paid less than you're worth and really not having the best color grading business that you can. So if that's where you're at, in your relationship with color grading, if you're looking to make it into a professional practice, or you've been grading professionally and you want to take it to the next level, definitely encourage you to check out the Colorist Career Accelerator. We have sold out every round of the course that we've done in the past, and it's going to sell out this time within usually a day or two of announcing it. So make sure you get on the wait list for that. We'll have a link up for that soon if it's not already up in the description for today's video. And I'm excited to see everyone in there. It's one of my favorite highlights of the year when we do the Colorist Career Accelerator. So quick plug. But the reason that came to mind is because we are talking about one of the tools that I offer up as a bonus to participants in the Colorist Career Accelerator. It's a DCL tool called the SatShaper. And I suppose if we're going to talk about it, there's no harm in actually showing it. Let's see if I can remember to show my resolve. There we go. All right, so this tool is called the SatShaper. I'm always so self-conscious about my DCTLs and how many things there are in there. So the SatShaper is effectively a more customized version of something we've talked about a ton here in grade school and on the channel in general, where we are working in a dedicated sat model and we are applying gamma and or gain to the image in order to get a particular flavor of saturation. So the question was, which models are you using here? Because you can see in this slider here, I'm getting two different flavors of saturation. Let me make this a little bit bigger for you guys, like that. You can see that as I move this slider, I'm getting more subtractive versus a more neutral style of saturation here. So on the subtractive side, this is just HSV, and on the left-hand side, this is a spherical color model that is very, very close to a color model that I've talked about in the past in my Discord, the so-called spherical Chen color model. So those are the two models that are being used there. That's a rather long couple minutes to answer a relatively straightforward question, but wanted to give everybody context and let everybody know how excited I am about the Colorist Career Accelerator. Okay. What's next?
We have a question here about using saturation in the color warper, but selecting the HSV color model inside the color warper. What is the difference of doing that and basically selecting a node and putting that node into HSV? What is the difference?
Ooh, that's a cool question. Yeah, so I'm just going to go into the color warper right now and flip it into HSV mode as was suggested. So here's the main difference that I would see. Like the color warper, first of all, like this, what I just did here, like you can get interesting things by doing this. It's also like fairly easy, at least by my measure, like to either break things or to do things you don't necessarily want to. Like for example, if I want to saturate this vector right here, but not move hue at all, really what I need to do is drag and select just that control point so that I'm not, or rather lasso that control point or marquee it, if that makes sense, and then reach for my sat and push it so that I know I'm not inadvertently moving this a little bit left or right, and in doing so rotating the hue. But as long as you impose some kind of constraints on yourself, you can get good results by doing this. And I think like the two differences I would call out there, the first one is that HSV has been around. We talked about this in grade school a couple of weeks ago. It's been around for a long time, and there are a couple different formulations floating around out there of HSV, and Resolve is using a particular formulation that I think may be unique to Resolve. They don't like expose that math to us, but it feels like there is a specific formulation in place there that maybe is slightly different than like the HSV formulation that we get when we do a tag into the HSV space. So that would be number one. Number two, this kind of connects right up to the SatShaper that we were just looking at, or to drawing a sat curve. For me, like I'd say the most common thing that I'm doing when I'm wanting to work with saturation is I'm wanting to do some kind of a like nuanced saturation adjustment along the lines of a sat curve. So something that I would work here, or with my gamma and with my gain, like so. And for me, I don't feel like the interface here in the color warper is really a suitable like representation of the saturation channel in that way, where I'm like, I guess if I wanted to create a compressed ceiling and then a pushed out toe, like I do with that gamma gain trick, I could do something like I'm doing here and start by choking that in, and then I could grab, maybe this inner ring here, like so, like these inner values and then push those out. But it's probably not hard to see how like I'm getting to a similar result there, but that's not really as fast or intuitive as just working gamma and gain against each other, for example. So a lot of it just comes down to interface for me, but totally something fun to play around with, and I wouldn't be shy about it. And the last thing I would point out is, kind of like we had a good conversation last week about something that my friend Maxine Gervais said during our recent conversation on the Color Code podcast. If you haven't had a chance to check that episode out yet, make sure you do. It's really cool. Maxine is one of my favorite colorists and is such a smart person, not only in doing her job, but in talking about it. But we were talking about the propensity of a curve to break the image, kind of in her words. And we had some questions about like, well, what does she mean by that? What she means is that you have a lot of degrees of freedom with a curve, so that it's entirely possible to do a dumb thing in your curve shape, right? I feel like in a curve, that's a little bit more obvious to me. Like if I do such a dumb thing as I'm alluding to, like this would be that kind of dumb thing. Like that's aggressive and dumb, and it looks dumb, doesn't it? Like it doesn't just look dumb on the image, it looks dumb in the curve, to use a technical term. My other like sort of caution that I would just throw out there with the color warper is it's equally possible to do dumb things in here because you have lots of degrees of freedom. But for me, it's not always as obvious that I'm doing something jagged or to abuse that same word, dumb. It's not quite as obvious to me that I'm doing something dumb when I do it in this interface as when I do it in the curves interface. That might just be me. That might be a personal preference, but just another caveat I wanted to throw out there. Make sure that you are doing gentle things here in the color warper and that you are not overplaying your hand in terms of the amount of freedom that this tool affords you.
Mm-hmm. We have another question, a few questions here about using HSV or HSL and finding artifacts once you push the image using gain or gamma. Do you have any workaround around those artifacts?
Yeah, I want to talk about that for a second because I feel like there's sort of a family of questions or of talking points that have come up around this recently in comments and here in grade school as well. And I'm going to give you guys kind of a mini talk on this right now. So first of all, so that we're all on the same page, my understanding of what generally we're talking about when people are saying like, oh, HSV and HSL can cause artifacts. I think generally what we're talking about is, is my panel not connected? That's a shame. What we're talking about is if I, let me make sure my channels are narrowed down. There we go. Like, it's entirely possible for me to create problematic artifacted results in my image. Like, I haven't even cranked my gamma that far, and I've got all this quote unquote breakage happening in the image, right? A couple things I want to point out. That's not, in my opinion, a flaw of the HSV color model. That has to do with the fact that when I turn my gamma this aggressively, I'm grabbing very, very low values and I'm aggressively pushing them up, and I'm creating more and more distance in between values that were originally quite close together, and they're simply starting to tear apart. In the same way that if I have an underexposed shot and I wish I'd exposed it 3 stops hotter, so I just twist my global exposure knob until I get there and the image starts to feel noisy, it's the same principle. I'm kind of tearing the image up because I am overplaying my hand. I'm hitting the image too hard with an adjustment. So I would say like this right here, and again, like this question has come up a fair amount recently, and I could be mistaken about what people are referring to. Maybe you're referring to some other kind of artifact. But when I see artifacts like this, I don't look at it and go, oh, what a bummer that HSV isn't a very clean color model. I go, I'm looking at the limitations of my SAT channel, and I'm pushing that SAT channel too hard. So even if I like what I'm seeing, even if I like, say, this level of saturation, I'm just pushing it too hard based on what's actually present in that saturation channel, okay? Another thing that I want to talk about that's highly related because, I'll say 2 things. HSL and HSV, as we've talked about before, they're very simple, very old color models. So they're not the only color models that have a saturation dimension that I like to use. But I also want to be fair to them in saying, first of all, they're not necessarily, in my experience, more artifact prone than any other color model. And I also want to address something else that's come up in terms of like criticisms of these color models. There's been a lot of conversation about like, oh, it's introducing hue shift when I saturate the image. And that's a totally valid criticism. That is something you will see like in the vector scope right now. If I do that same maneuver, like you will see hues that, especially secondaries, they're going to shift. They're going to move around as I saturate or desaturate my image. But here's the thing. That, again, is not, in my opinion, necessarily like a flaw or a con or a shortcoming of HSV. That really has to do with the way RGB colors work. If you think about the RGB displays that we all look at every day, we have red, green, and blue emitters, right? What would be the three most saturated colors that we can produce on our displays? It would be either pure red, pure green, or pure blue, right? What if I have a secondary, right? What if I have a yellow and I'm trying to saturate my yellow? Well, there's going to come a point where if I have a 1-1-0, one red, one green, no blue, there's going to come a point where if I want to get more saturated than a 1-1-0, the only thing that I can do is start to subtract that second one so that I'm going to start rotating toward red. Does that make sense? In an RGB system, your primaries, your colors that are capable of peak saturations are your red, your green, and your blue. So you should expect secondaries to collapse as you start demanding that they become more saturated when they are already at the full saturation of your display. All right. So like, I don't want to get too far off into the weeds on that color science there, but I just want to point out that hues which rotate toward primaries, that's just kind of a feature of RGB systems. Are there other color models that endeavor to avoid that and to keep hue constant? Yes, but those color models have their own drawbacks. They're not a walk in the park either. So that's not directly related to a question that was asked, but I think both of those things, talking about artifact prone nature of HSL and HSV, and also saying, oh, well, they are creating hue rotations. There's an element of truth in both of those things, but I think there's also a bit more nuance than saying, oh, these are things that make HSL or HSV bad candidates, and we need to be seeking a better color model than one of these two.
Can you explain the saturation in the HDR wheels? I've heard that those are color space aware, but I don't really know what does that mean in terms of saturation.
Yeah, so to be honest with you, I don't exactly know what that means either. We can, just make a general observation that if we go into the HDR zones and we find wherever that saturation knob, I guess we're just talking about the saturation wheels here. But if we just look at global saturation for a second, that already looks a lot nicer than what we've seen in some other scenarios. And what we can observe if we say, oh, this is color space aware, is that if I change my color space, for example, let's just do something dumb. I'm going to change like to ACES AP0. That's going to change the saturation because remember what we talked about in this week's video. Saturation is kind of a matter, it's a three-step process. We're going to say, okay, I have an RGB image. How am I going to decide what of that image represents color versus what of that image represents luminance? That's number one. That's the saturation formula that's being used. Number two, having derived that saturation component, what am I going to do to it? That's the second piece of the puzzle, right? And then finally, I need to move back into the original RGB space that I was in so that the only net change is an increase in saturation. So what's happening here when we talk about color space awareness is in the HDR zones palette, it is trying to use a colorimetric and color space accurate formula for deriving saturation, which there are a couple of candidates for, but what I would imagine is most likely is that we are using this is kind of a wild guess. I could be wrong about this. My first guess here would be that we are using that it's moving the source color space into XYZ and from there into cap Y little xy. By the way, if you ever look at a chromaticity chart where you see that triangle and the horseshoe, that is YXY space that you are looking at, where the XY coordinates just represent a particular color position independent of luminance. So I think probably what's happening here is we're calculating cap y little xy. Cap y is remaining constant, and little x and little y are being scaled at the same rate so that we are expanding color out in a more colorimetric, more principled way. Remember, we talked in this week's video about how there's no single explicit correct definition of saturation. That formulation that I just gave would be the closest thing to a colorimetric definition of saturation that there is. Now, when I say colorimetric, I'm the contrasting term there would be perceptual, because colorimetric and perceptual don't always agree. But that would be my guess as to what's going on there. But you can certainly observe that whatever is going on, it is attempting to do something, we could say colorimetric, in deriving its saturation channel, because the results change when we change our working color space here inside of the HDR zones palette.
We have mentioned earlier using 3x3 matrix for balance. So the question here is, how does RGB values using, for example, a matrix or gain relate to saturation? How can you manipulate saturation without using the saturation knob?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think of which direction to go with this. You want to know, like, easiest, simplest way to manipulate saturation without using the saturation knob inside of Resolve? This isn't necessarily a good thing, but it is a fact. Watch this. I'm just going to increase my contrast, except for my knob is off here. I'm just going to go higher contrast, a bit more pivot. I'm just going to go to kind of an extreme place here for a second. Check this out. Off, on, off, on. Vector scope, I'm expanding my color. So there's a rule, there's a law in RGB color space, which we already touched on a moment ago when we were talking about how do we achieve maximum saturation. In RGB, if you imagine a initial condition like this, where all inputs, or rather where all output equals all input, so a unity do nothing custom curve, any time that you are altering that formula, you are going to have a secondary effect on hues and saturation. Like I said, this connects up really strongly to what we were talking about a moment ago. So that's the easiest way to manipulate saturation without a dedicated knob, is just to manipulate tonality. When you're manipulating RGB, as opposed to manipulating like a Y channel, like we have here, you are going to get a net change in saturation. Whereas if I'm just doing my Y, you can see that the vector scope mass, I might need to set my luminance mix like so. You can see that the vector scope mass is, or mass rather, is, oh, never mind, I got that wrong. This was in the right position before. The vector scope mass is not going to move as much. That's also the kind of principle behind, by the way, I'm in Resolve 18.5 finally, so I've got my composite mode available to me in this handy right-click context menu. Big fan. But that's the whole principle behind doing like luminosity blending mode here. Now, that same thing I just said about contrast altering RGB is not going to be nearly as true, and it's not going to move as much as I increase or decrease contrast. But to answer the question, that's one of the ways that we can manipulate saturation. You can actually have a saturation matrix, which like doesn't do anything at all except saturate the image further. So that's like, you can have a direct correlation there, where you're basically just increasing your red and red, green and green, and blue, and leaving your other terms alone. That's you can have a literally what's called a saturation matrix. So that's another way of doing it. There's lots of ways to manipulate like the colorfulness of the image, and specifically the way that colors plot on your vector scope, in order to get a more pleasing rendering. I think the challenge, like to kind of zoom out even from the conversation we had in this week's pre-recorded video, is to figure out like, all right, what is a form of that that looks good to our eye? So to think more perceptually and to find solutions that work perceptually, as opposed to things that are strictly colorimetrically accurate but may not be producing perceptually pleasing results.
let's talk about saturation in color management. Can you explain the saturation compression algorithm in the color space transform? And also, is there a best practice or a correct way to use it?
Can I explain the saturation compression algorithm in the color space transform? Sort of. Let's do a trick that we had some fun with in last grade school. We're going to do a sort of like last mile strategy where I'm going to go to my color management here and I'm going to set my output color space to be equal to DaVinci wide gamut intermediate, or rather I'll just say same as timeline. And so now I've got no output transform when I hit save, which means if I want a 7 or 9 transform, I need to do a CST to 7 or 9. Okay? I'm going to go DaVinci wide gamut, DaVinci intermediate, Rec 7 or 9, gamut 2.4, luminance mapping. This is kind of my formula that I like to use. This is very close, but not identical to what we just had, and actually where it differs from what we just had when we had our output transform in our project settings is down here in our saturation compression. And probably the easiest way to evaluate this would be on like a 3D RGB cube. Let's check this out for a second here. I haven't actually done this anytime recently, so we'll see if this works. But I'm going to do a little trick that I really like to do using a cube generator DCTL and Omniscope. And if we look at how this output transform is affecting our end image, let me try connecting Resolve one more time here. What I'm wanting to do is get a rendering on our 3D cube of what's happening. Although it looks like the gods may not be with us for that today. Wow, that's super weird. Let me just try popping up a brand new 3D cube. Weird. Okay. Something's funky with my Omniscope. I probably just need to restart my machine. I think I've had it running for like a month straight or something. But what I wanted to look at is really the way that, you know, like the saturation compression is shaping and compressing saturations at sort of like the outer diameter of our color cube. Essentially what's being done here, I can tell you in broadest strokes, is we are looking at negative values and sort of compressing those in. So this is a way of saying like, hey, DaVinci wide gamut to Rec 709. By the way, this kind of connects up to, we were talking about matrices for a moment. If you guys want to get geeky and sort of understand what's happening just right here, even before we get into any of these pieces, some of you guys may already be hip to this, and if so, you can kind of fill in the, you can try to beat me to the answer here. But essentially, we're going to do, if we want to go from DaVinci wide gamut intermediate to Rec 709 gamma 2.4 in the simplest form possible, what are we going to do? Well, we are going to start by linearizing our DaVinci intermediate log curve. So we are going to go from DaVinci wide gamut intermediate to DaVinci wide gamut linear. And when I summarize this, what I mean to say is this is what is actually happening under the hood in order to make this color space transform. So the first step, DaVinci wide gamut intermediate to DaVinci wide gamut intermediate, or excuse me, to DaVinci wide gamut linear. Okay. Now that we are in linear, we are going to apply a matrix that takes us from DaVinci wide gamut to Rec 709. Okay, that's the second step in the process. Finally, we're now in Rec 709 linear, and we are going to move from Rec 709 linear to gamma 2.4, or whatever our output gamma is. So just summarizing those steps one more time: DaVinci wide gamut intermediate to DaVinci wide gamut linear, DaVinci wide gamut linear to Rec 709 linear, and finally Rec 709 linear to Rec 709 gamma 2.4. Those are the actual steps that are happening under the hood. And the reason I wanted to walk through all those is at the origin point, we can assume, let's assume that we have pixels that are all living in between 0 and 1. What's going to happen when we apply that matrix to go from DaVinci wide gamut to Rec 709 linear is if we have a full range of 0 to 1 values in our original source image, we are now going to have values that are outside of the 0 to 1 range. Those pixels are, of course, not going to show up on my display. My display doesn't show code values below 0 or above 1. But if we want to prevent hard clipping, that's where this gamut mapping saturation compression method comes in that says, hey, as values are approaching 0 or 1, we're going to basically apply a little bit of a toe or a little bit of a shoulder so that we're gently compressing in the same way that we compress tonally, right? Like I can't tell you the exact curve shape off the top of my head, but it's similar. It's basically operating on your saturation with like a shoulder like this and saying, hey, imagine that this line right here is actually your 1. The saturation compression function is basically saying, hey, as we approach that, compress those values so that instead of everything higher than that just blasting through the ceiling and hard clipping, we're rolling those values in. That's what's happening with that saturation compression scheme. Now, what the shape of that curve is, what color model is being used to do that mapping, I don't know, and I don't have boundless confidence that the optimal choices are being made there. But that is, in summary, what's happening is it's effectively applying a shoulder and or a toe to the saturation of your image as a result of having been transformed from a very large color space to a much smaller color space. I hope that gives some general context anyway.
Jim is here with us another week, and he's asking how it's about basically how the cameras see saturation, why sometimes there are discrepancies between what the camera captures versus what we get in result. Basically, is there a problem with the display function? Is there a problem with the camera? And if that's a problem with the capture device, shouldn't we be able to fix that in the IDT?
Oh boy. Even for Jim, I feel like that's a really, really fun question. So let's chop that up for a minute. This is like, I ask some form of this question, I feel like almost every week. So I think what I want to focus on are 2 areas of difficulty where, like, just to, synopsize or very quickly summarize what Jim is asking. It's basically like, why do we not get more one-to-one reproduction, especially of very saturated colors, like when we're on set capturing, by the time it actually gets rendered out through color management? Why are we so prone to artifacts and to reproduction that doesn't match very well to the original scene, right? Why does that happen? There are 2 areas that I want to focus on for that. The first one is our color management framework itself. We've already touched on this here in this session. The crazy reality is that color management by default, like in Resolve color management, in the current form of ACES, in virtually every form of color management that is out there except for Baselight's TCAM color management system, we are doing what's called a per channel transformation. So we are directly operating on red, green, and blue in order to tone map and in order to make our transformation from space A to space B. So when we go from, in this case, area wide gamut 3 Alexa, or area wide gamut 3 log C3, I should say, into DaVinci wide gamut intermediate, that log transfer function that we're doing there, that's being done directly to RGB. And then when we go out to our display, we're going from our log space DaVinci intermediate out to gamma 2.4, and we're tone mapping and all that stuff directly on RGB. As we highlighted a moment ago, anytime you are operating directly on RGB, you are going to introduce changes in hue and saturation that are not innate of the original scene. They're just innate of operating on those channels. Essentially, you are going to either you're going to get things collapsing toward your primaries or collapsing toward your secondaries, depending on whether you're going up or down with your values. And you're also going to get a net increase in saturation or a net decrease in saturation. So that's, in my opinion, maybe it's one of the 2 areas where the most error gets introduced and the most problem gets introduced is by using a per channel color management scheme. Another notable color management scheme that does not use a per channel strategy is a output transform called OpenDRT, developed by a really smart dude named Jed Smith. So that's another one that's worth checking out. I'll see if I can dig up a link for you guys and share it. But that's another one that does not use a per channel strategy. So it actually is more accurate to what the scene originally saw. So that's piece number one. Most conventional color management frameworks are actually not terribly accurate with higher saturations, with saturations in general, in terms of the way that they render colors versus what they actually were. And lest we like throw too much shade at all those color management frameworks, one of the reasons for that is like that's how film works too. There's all kinds of hue shift and hue collapse and hue rotation happening in a film system, and film itself is also operating on a per channel basis. Film doesn't have a luminance layer. Film has a red layer, a green layer, and a blue layer, or a red sensitive, a green sensitive, and a blue sensitive layer. Those layers are actually cyan, magenta, and yellow, as you guys probably know. So there's a long legacy of doing per channel transformation, but it doesn't change the fact that transforming per channel does indeed cause problems. And final thought there, just on the color management side, the candidate transforms for ACES 2.0, I believe the one that they have started to narrow in on and are currently refining is in fact a more modern, more accurate color management framework along the lines of what I'm talking about, where it is not per channel. It's actually applying tone mapping and gamma conversion in a derived Y space as opposed to directly on RGB. I think that's the one they've landed on. I hope that's the one they've landed on because I think it's long overdue. That's number one. That's the first place where I feel like so much of the inaccuracy in our images gets introduced is with color management frameworks that, in my opinion, are not as accurate as they really should be, given the whole premise, the whole value prop of color management. That's number one. Number two, camera sensors, the way, as you guys may know as well, the way that we characterize a camera sensor in terms of like, a camera sensor just captures data, right? All it has is red, green, and blue photosites. It doesn't have a saturation photosite. It doesn't even have a luminance photosite. It just captures a certain amount of red, certain amount of green, certain amount of blue. So as we've talked about in virtually any conversation about color management, the first thing that we need to do if we're going to color manage an image from camera X is figure out like, okay, well, that's great that you captured 50% red and 20% green and no blue, for example. But how do I relate that to any other system? What color space does that correlate to? Usually that's a color space that is unique to that camera, and it's one that is characterized by the manufacturer using our friend, the 3x3 matrix. Matrices are linear in nature. Remember, like we've talked about shaping cubes and look development and things like that in the past. You really can't shape a cube with a matrix. All you can do is rotate and skew a cube, but you can't really like sculpt it in any more detail than that. That really is not enough nuance to characterize all of the subtlety and nonlinearity of a camera sensor. So what you end up having to do is say like, well, what's more important to you? Brake lights or human skin, for example. And any matrix that we have available to us, any matrix like Aries published matrix to get from Arilog C3 to XYZ, for example, that matrix is not perfect for all colors. It can't be perfect for all colors because it's linear, okay? So in lieu of a perfect transform, that matrix has been optimized for what's generally the most important thing in our frames, which is human skin and low to medium saturations in that register. But that's also why high saturations tend to be the most artifact prone, because the matrix wasn't optimized for those, and it was rather optimized for human skin and for low to moderate saturations. Okay. And just to round out this conversation as a good counter example of that, the new Alexa 35, as you guys might know, it actually is using a different vehicle than a 3x3 matrix to get from camera native onto the dry land of a known color space. It is using a black box, non-invertible, non-linear transformation so that you are getting a more faithful characterization, not just of low, but also of high saturations by the time you land in your working space. And if you were to marry that with a more accurate color management framework, something like OpenDRT, I think that would be the best system strategy for getting more accurate reproduction of higher saturations with less artifacts. boy, that was a lot of stuff to talk about, but I really like that this question came up, and I hope that that's a good general primer on the subject that can help you navigate this area and can help us all to start to advocate for better solutions when it comes to our color management frameworks and IDTs for that matter.
Question here about balancing the image. If you want to achieve this classic super white look, like for commercials and all the stuff, what do you think about reducing the gamma, using HSV, reducing the gamma, and then boosting up the gain to balance the low saturations against the high saturations? What kind of problems might you face using this?
Did we say dropping the gamma and boosting the gain, or other way around?
Yeah, lowering the gamma and then boosting the gain.
That's a really cool idea. I hadn't thought about that. So let's do the thought experiment. Let's track with the suggestion. So what we're talking about is sort of as a script flip on what I normally talk about, where I'm like, oh, I kind of want to compress my saturations by taking my high saturations over here down, i.e. gain, and boosting my lower saturations. That's often what I talk about as being kind of a filmic rendering, and is indeed like more akin to like the saturation response of a film system, where you're actually getting really good response and really vibrant color response right up until you're not, right? So like that's what I normally talk about. What we're suggesting here is kind of doing the opposite, where you're saying like, all right, well, let's gain up here and then gamma down, roughly speaking, everywhere else. I think that's a really cool idea. And you can see already, like if I just look at, it's going to be all about, this is something that you might not be able to get the results you're looking for just with gamma and gain. You might need to kind of use that as your base idea and then go in here in your custom curves and finesse it. Because you can see like I'm having to grab pretty far low down. The whole premise of the idea here is that we are desaturating stuff that's already close to zero sat. That's why we're taking low saturations even lower. But you can see even if I go to like where gamma typically would affect it, that's taken down everything pretty well, because the saturation channel lives a lot over here on the left-hand side. So you'd probably have to sneak it pretty far over to the left. But having done so, like I feel like that's working really nicely in terms of keeping near neutrals low sat, or even low, like reducing their sat. Like it's tough to see over YouTube, but like this wall is getting more neutral when I apply this change. So you can see how it's a little more bluey here, and it's a little more neutral there, even while my overall saturation is increasing. Gosh, I'm stealing that idea. That's a really cool idea. That's a really imaginative way of thinking about a saturation curve in more than one way. I've talked about it a lot in the opposite way, but I think this could be a great strategy, especially if you're trying to get a cleaner look. And just to sort of like round out the exploration of like, what if we want to do a popping, but like very neutral neutrals type of look? The other thing that I would make sure of in a workflow like this is like, you know, the first do no harm principle that I talk about in my book, The Colorist 10 Commandments. Right now, I am violating that rule. If my intent is to keep my neutrals and near neutrals at low to no saturation, I am fighting against my own premise right now a little bit. Does anyone know how I'm doing that, or what I mean when I say that? As always, I wish that there was less lag in the chat so that we could have a more interactive forum, which, by the way, one of my favorite parts about the Colorist Career Accelerator, I can ask you guys questions like that. I can quiz you, see if you're paying attention, see if you've been paying attention, and actually look at the answers trickle in live, but no such luck today. At least maybe you've had a chance to answer for yourself. But what I'm doing, the harm that I am doing right now that I would like to avoid, is over here at my look level. I am using my 3510 LUT, which biases neutrals, doesn't it? Anytime, by the way, that you want to evaluate this, easiest thing to do is to go into the edit page and just create a quick grayscale ramp. So I'm going to go to my effects, generators, grayscale, drop it in the timeline here, and then we just need to create a compound node from it so that it shows up on the color page. So I'm just going to call this ramp, like so. And now I'm going to go back over to the color page, And you can see my 3510 here. See how my neutrals are all one line initially? Let's even bypass our color management so that we don't have to evaluate that dimension of things, like so. One unit line, just like we would see in our custom curves here. But these are now, in addition to giving me some extra contrast and some highlight and shadow roll, my color channels are diverging a little bit. Like they're separate. They're not stacked on top of each other as neatly anymore. That's biasing neutrals. Anytime, this is a great rule of thumb to keep in mind. Anytime you are moving channels away from one another here in your custom curves, you are biasing your neutrals. So if your goal is a really clean whites are white, shadows are black type of reproduction, then you want to make sure that you are not doing anything that's going to fight against you there. So what I'm going to do here is turn this 3510 off so that I'm not getting that biasing of my shadows or of my highlights. And if you're like me, what you're going to find is like, oh wow, when I turn that off, I totally see what it was doing. The only problem is I kind of miss it. At least that's like my assessment by eye is like, oh, I love the like wrap, the shape that's creating around her face with those cooler shadows. But that's another conversation. If you want to get true neutrals without poisoning your neutrals anywhere on the tone scale, make sure that you're not using a look, whether that's a film emulation look or one of the tone modifier looks from my Voyager LUT Pack. Make sure you're not using something at your overall look level that's biasing your neutrals, because that's of course directly at odds with what you're attempting to do. But back to the question and the exploration. I love this idea. I'm stealing it from you. Thanks for suggesting it.
Let's take a rest from saturation for a second. And if you use a grayscale ramp and you apply a lookup table, you can recreate using the custom curves what you see in the waveform. So what are the difference between doing that and using the lookup table? What kind of settings can you recreate in Resolve by default of a lookup table?
Oh, fun question. Yeah, so let's chop that up for a second here. So just to get everyone on the same page, what we are talking about is, let's really simplify things for a minute. I'm just going to go down to one LUT. So I'm just looking at my 3510 here. I'm going to turn my output transform off. I'm going to go back over to this compound clip that we had here. And essentially what is being observed is like, hey, if you spend enough time, you know, like if I grab a still of this, maybe. What gods have I offended? Stills aren't grabbing, omniscope's not working. What am I doing wrong? I must not be living right. Well, it's probably going to populate with like 20 different stills in just a second because I'm being impatient. But what we're observing, I was going to grab a still so I could wipe between the two states, but we're observing that you could essentially do like a trace job and say like, oh, I think it looked a little bit like this. And you could just go in and like slowly trace what you were seeing in, for example, the Fuji 3510. And what I would generally do here is like try to get the overall shape right, which I'm very much just kind of eyeballing at the moment. Boy, I wish I could grab a still. There we go. So let's turn this off, turn that back on. So here's going to be my reference. And, you know, we could look at like a couple different ways you could do this, but one that you could do is to actually do a difference mode. Like so. Actually, there's my difference mode. And so now, this is kind of zany, but you're essentially only seeing the difference between what's happening in the reference still versus what's happening down here. And you could look at, you know, kind of trying to like basically make a flat line down below. This takes a little bit of practice to figure out, but it's something that I've played around with before where we're essentially just trying to trace it until we have a net zero reproduction. But you could also go with a more straightforward approach of just wiping and saying like, okay, if I look at my reference, that's lower here. I'm going to go full frame now. So like that's a good general characterization of what I'm seeing. If I trace that, right? Like I'm not doing an amazing job, but that's getting somewhere into the ballpark, right? So, and then what I would do from here is like get this curve and then look at like where's red going up and where's green going down and get some of that per channel difference. So the question is, if I were to go to all the trouble of really tightly tracing that 1D curve, how close would I be to the behavior of this LUT? Well, the answer is that it depends on the LUT in question. If the LUT is something like one of my Voyager tone palette LUTs, which we talked about a moment ago, or excuse me, Voyager tone foundation LUTs, these are 1D LUTs. All they are is a 1D curve. So you could actually recreate, well, I take that back. They're almost that simple. They do have a little bit of a 3D component to them. But if you have a true 1D LUT that only is doing stuff to red, stuff to green, and stuff to blue with no interaction, you can one-to-one recreate that curve in Resolve with enough time and get it like a one-to-one accurate to what the LUT was doing. But in the case of like this Fuji 3510 or a lot of the other LUTs that you're going to be using, we're only getting the 1D dimension of things. So what we are getting is, with red in its own lane, what happens to output red at every possible input of red? And you can see what happens to it is, at an input of 0, it's actually going to output, like a 0.1 or so. Like at an input of a 0.2, it's going to output close to a 0.2, a little bit less. Like you could kind of describe the red lane and what's going to happen in between input and output for red. And then you would do the same thing for green. And then you would do the same thing for blue. That's a 1D LUT. That's a 1D transformation. And that describes a lot of freedom. But here's the one thing you cannot do with your custom curves or with a 1D LUT. I cannot say, for example, if the red is at a 0.2, the green should be at a 0.3. There's no interaction between the channels. I can't create relationships between the channels because they're living in their own lanes. Technically, when we say 1D LUT, when we're talking about motion imaging, what we're really talking about is a 3x 1D LUT, or 3 individual 1D LUTs, one for the red, one for the green, and one for the blue channel. Contrast that with a 3D LUT, in which you can say, hey, if red, green, and blue are this, it should produce a red, green, and blue output of that. It's thinking and operating in 3 dimensions. That's the part that you can't do anything to reproduce here in your custom curves. You would need to use a much more complex tool in order to recreate the 3D behavior of a LUT. But if you've got a LUT that's only a 1D or is primarily doing 1D things, then by the time you were to go in and say get a really tight clone of the curve of this 3510, you would indeed have a very close recreation of what the 3510 was doing. But you can see even in this case, like if I go back into my normal image and turn my color management and everything back on, like if I grab a still of this and then turn that off and turn this back on here, I didn't do a great job of matching that curve, but we're like nowhere near one another because there's all this 3D stuff happening in there as well. Hope that's some helpful food for thought.
Let's go back to saturation. We talked before about using gamma and gain in HSV. So the question here is, what about lift and offset? Those usually produce a lot of artifacts, but the operation itself can be very useful if it wasn't because of those artifacts. So is there any way to limit the values you are producing using lift or offset to 0 and not introduce any artifacts?
Ooh, I'm so glad this came up. I'm really glad we're talking about this. No, there is not. You should not ever use lift or offset when you are operating on a saturation channel. Full stop. Why am I saying that? Why is that? Well, let's think about what lift does for a minute, and we can talk about offset in a moment, but lift is maybe an even easier example to make. Let's just once again go to our grayscale ramp and turn off all disjunct. And let's just remember what lift does. Lift affects everything in the image except for values of 1, right? It's basically increasing or decreasing contrast with a pivot of a 1, right? But lift has its most dramatic effect. It affects most quickly values that are resting at 0, doesn't it? Okay, let's think about using lift with a saturation channel. What does a saturation channel value of 0 represent? Well, that represents no saturation, right? If you have no saturation, now I'm not talking about little saturation, I'm talking about no saturation. If you have no saturation and you go to increase that saturation, what does that even mean? Like, how do you increase? This is not a perfect example because, as we've already seen today, this white wall over here is actually not a true, pure, colorless white wall. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that it is. If I use a lift operation to target that colorless wall and I am trying to saturate it, what hue angle am I saturating toward? There is no hue angle. It has no hue angle because it has no saturation whatsoever. So what you're doing with lift is targeting the only values that you should never move when you're manipulating a saturation channel, which is values of 0. Because a pixel with a saturation, a derived saturation value of 0, that has to stay a 0. It can't be moved up or down because it doesn't make any sense. Increasing the saturation of a neutral, it just doesn't make sense because it's like, well, what hue angle should I be saturating toward? It's completely arbitrary. That's why lift breaks your image. And what you're talking about when you say, but it's actually advantageous, is because, as we looked at a moment ago, lift affects lots of image area. In fact, the only part of the image that it doesn't affect is ones and higher values, or 1 specifically. So what you're seeing is, oh, it's doing nice things to my low moderate saturations as well, because it's biased to affect those things more quickly than your higher saturations that are up near 1, right? But what's a better tool to use instead of lift for that purpose? Better tool to use for that would be either gamma or to use your custom curves. So that same behavior that you're going to see when you, let me get my channel set up here. You know, if I go in and I use my lift, like, oh, we're getting all this interesting stuff, right? It's this like really fast takeoff in the low to moderate saturations that feels really good, but it's also like almost immediately breaking stuff, right? Like over here in this area. So lift is out. But if I want to get some of this same quality here, let's grab a still, turn lift off, and I'm not even going to go to gamma. I'm going to go and do like just a little kind of like toe thing down here. You can see I'm getting, that's just a quick eyeball, but I'm getting a better result, and I'm going to be able to push it further, not infinitely further, but much further, by letting 0 remain at 0 and letting things right near 0, which do have some hue, some saturation, capitalizing on those things and boosting them up. But you can't saturate something with 0 saturation and expect a sensible result, because that's not a sensible thing to suggest, okay? And just to round it out, offset's the same way. Offset moves the entire image, right? So those are the two primaries operators that are going to move 0, which is the one constraint that you should always impose on manipulating a saturation channel. 0 must stay at 0. 0 cannot go up or it cannot go down, or you're going to introduce artifacts, regardless of what else the operation you're doing that moves 0. It might be doing other things that you find beneficial, but if it's moving 0, then you're going to get what you ask for, which is madness, chaos. I hope that's helpful. Let's do one more if we've got a shorter one.
Let me take a good one then. Maybe we can talk about why lift in the opposite way, going down, also produces artifacts.
Yeah, sure. So lift going in the opposite direction, applying negative lift to a saturation channel, what that's going to do is produce a saturation channel with negative values. And if we think about the round trip transformation, when we're going, remember we talked about our sort of saturation formula. Saturation formula is calculate some kind of saturation channel and transform the image so that one of its dimensions is saturation, do a thing to that derived saturation channel, and then round trip back to RGB once done so that the only net change is in the saturation of the image. The expected domain of that saturation channel is 0 to 1, right? So if you feed that saturation color model, whatever it is, call it HSV. If you feed that HSV to RGB transform a negative value, it's going to spit up something irrational because it's not expecting negative values. It's expecting positive values. So that would be the main like practical reason. But again, if we just think about it from a philosophical POV, in the same way that you can't add saturation to a zero saturation pixel, you can't take saturation away from it either. It just is what it is. If you're going to desat it, it's almost like the question is not why is the model spitting up these artifacts. The question is, why am I asking for a nonsensical thing? Negative lift, negative offset, that in addition, again, to whatever else it might be doing that is reasonable and that you like the results of, you are also asking for something that doesn't have that isn't physically possible. Desaturate this completely neutral color or increase the color of this completely neutral color. Neither of those things are possible in a practical sense. So what you're seeing is a model that really doesn't know what to do with your nonsensical instructions. Okay, guys, y'all are awesome. This was a great session. I'm excited that we got to go even deeper into saturation than we have in prior grade school sessions, and to kind of build on what we talked about in this week's pre-recorded video. I feel like we also got to clear up some things and some talking points that I've wanted to cover for a while on HSL, HSV operators within what I generally call cylinder or saturation component color models. So lots of good stuff. Hope you found some useful things in there. Thanks for being here, guys. I always enjoy Friday mornings with y'all. It's one of my favorite parts of the week. As I mentioned at the beginning of our time together here today, get ready for the Colorist Career Accelerator if you are serious about starting your professional color grading practice or taking that practice to the next level. It's coming up in just a couple weeks here. Really, it's going to be happening in October. So we'll get a waitlist link out to you guys soon if it's not already available. And I hope to see all of you guys in there. It's a forum that I really love. And I talked earlier in the session today about all the cool stuff that we're going to cover in that course, but it's really aimed at building up your ideal professional color grading practice and helping you make money at what you love most, and helping you get really, really good at offering great value to your clients. So I hope to see you in there if you're interested in that. Either way, I hope you have a great Friday and a great weekend, and I will see you back here on the channel next week. And thanks to Rafa for co-hosting with me. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.